Hey everyone, this is a piece by Monika Albrecht, and it says a description of Monika Albrecht says Monika Albrecht is professor of literary and cultural studies at the University of Vechta, Germany, and director of a university partnership with Greece. Her areas of research are in German culture, history, politics, and literature of the 20th/21st century. Recent publications include Southeastern European History as Postcolonial History and Displacement and Extinction of the Ottoman Greeks. The piece is titled Unthinking Postcolonialism, on the necessity for a reset instead of a step forward. I'll probably be looking a lot of things up in this piece, so beware of that. Not too long ago, in a discussion with colleagues at my home university, I outlined a project that would bring together a range of fields similar to those represented in this volume. One of the first questions I was asked about this project was whether, quote, former colonized people, end quote, were amongst the scholars involved. This was another manifestation of the, quote, normalization of the post-colonial perspective, end quote. Goethe. A normalization that reflexively generates, amongst other things, time and again exactly this kind of question. However, there was no simple, quote, yes or, quote, no answer in this case, the case of a project that brought together scholars from Western, East Central, and Southeastern Europe. Even though I would not necessarily go so far as to insist on the term, quote, former colonized people, or, quote, colonialism for that matter, the answer could have been, quote, yes. Amongst the scholars involved were several whose ancestors have been affected by other types of imperial rule than that of the Western colonial and imperial powers. With this introductory anecdote, I have already addressed some of the main issues this chapter will discuss. First, I will call concepts and assumptions about post-colonialism and post-imperialism as developed in the field of post-colonial studies into question, and second, I will outline reflections and ideas for a fresh start. In my view, this fresh start must go beyond a rethinking or revising of the foundations of post-colonial thought. At the same time, I will occasionally draw attention to the apparent normality of a, quote, post-colonial view, end quote. Lutzeler, as touched upon above. A few words in advance. Since critique of post-colonial premises is often misunderstood or even perceived to be a retrograde defense of colonialism, my critique aims at a reductive discursive framework. This chapter is, of course, not meant as an attempt to relativize any kind of colonial wrongdoings. Focusing on other areas and carving out alternative concepts does not mean that colonial and neocolonial discourses of power, as prioritized by mainstream post-colonial scholarship, do not exist. So I have to duplicate this PDF in order to get to the footnotes. Footnote. For my use of the term, quote, post-colonial mainstream, end quote, see the explanatory note in the introduction to this volume. End footnote. There is no possible justification for colonial violence or exploitation of either the colonial subject or the natural or cultural resources of colonized peoples. One of the merits of post-colonial scholarship is that post-colonial scholarship has emphatically drawn attention to the tremendous injustice of colonial endeavors. In this respect, the most welcome aspect of the current normalization of the post-colonial perspective includes, simply put, The fact that unlike 60 or 70 years ago, insight into these injustices and into the monstrosity of colonialism is being widely discussed. Discussions of colonial atrocities have not only reached academic discourse, but also a wider public. As an article in the German newspaper Frankfurter Rundschau put it 10 years ago, quote, "Who would nowadays in all seriousness cast the crimes of colonialism into doubt?" End quote. Indeed, the, quote, "normalization of the post-colonial perspective, in a sense, necessitates a critical glance at colonial domination," end quote. Gutsche, 2012. Having said this, in order to illustrate why I will nonetheless highlight the problematic sides of post-colonial thought, I would like to use an argument developed in a quite different context. The Russian anarchist and philosopher Peter Kropotkin was faced with a set of objections which are, in a sense, similar to those I may face. In the late 19th century, Kropotkin published his theory of, quote, "mutual aid as a factor of evolution," end quote, as an alternative concept to Darwin and to what political ideology made out of Darwin's biological theories. Opposing the normalization of a social Darwinist view amongst his contemporaries, Kropotkin pointed out in the introduction of his study, quote, "It may be objected to this book that both animals and men are represented in it under too favorable an aspect, that their sociable qualities are insisted upon, while their antisocial and self-asserting instincts are hardly touched upon. This was, however, unavoidable," end quote. Kropotkin, 1902. From today's perspective, Kropotkin's following explanation reads like a Foucauldian insight avant la lettre. Kropotkin's theory brings to mind Foucault's idea that, quote, "the discourse not only, quote, makes it possible to construct the topic in a certain way, the discourse also limits the other ways in which the topic can be constructed," end quote. Or as Kropotkin himself put it, quote, "We have heard so much lately of the, quote, harsh, pitiless struggle for life," end quote, which was said to be carried on by every animal against all other animals, every, quote, savage against all other, quote, savages, and every civilized man against all his co-citizens. And these assertions have so much become an article of faith that it was necessary first of all to oppose to them a wide series of facts showing animal and human life under a quite different aspect. Kropotkin, 1902. Kropotkin by no means denies that there was ample evidence for the theory of, quote, survival of the fittest, end quote. Quote, the, parenthesis, financially, end parenthesis, fittest, end quote. Or for that matter, the, quote, might is right, end quote. But Kropotkin was only too aware of the power of discourse. Kropotkin therefore realized the importance of in Judith Butler's term, quote, reiterative and citational practice, end quote. Butler, 1993. Yeah. Continuing on. One second. The Butler book being referred to is Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of, quote, Sex. The description for Bodies That Matter by Judith Butler from, what year? 1993 says, In Bodies That Matter, renowned theorist and philosopher Judith Butler argues that theories of gender need to return to the most material dimension of sex and sexuality, the body. Butler offers a brilliant reworking of the body, examining how the power of heterosexual hegemony forms the, quote, matter of bodies, sex, and gender. Butler argues that power operates to constrain sex from the start, limiting what counts as a viable sex. Butler clarifies the notion of, quote, performativity introduced in Gender Trouble and via bold readings of Plato, Irigare, I don't know how to say that person's name, Lacan, Freud, explores the meaning of a citational politics. She also draws on documentary and literature with compelling interpretations of the film Paris is Burning, Nella Larsen's Passing, and short stories by Willa Cather. Back to the text. A practice necessary to create an alternative discourse and thereby present an argument in, quote, opposed to, end quote, what has already become, quote, an article of faith, end quote, in an existing discourse. Shit. Returning to the thesis of this chapter, to the, quote, articles of faith, end quote, in post-colonial studies that I consider to be problematic, I will begin to analyze the contradictions within the field. Let me start to unravel these, quote, articles of faith, end quote, by pointing to a central contradiction which is, strangely enough, rarely discussed. On the one hand, the mainstream post-colonial view conceives post-colonialism to be a global phenomenon. On the other hand, as documented extensively in the introduction to this volume, the majority of post-colonial approaches are in time and space confined to a part of the globe and that part of the globe's history. Indeed, as a glance at the Oxford Handbook of Post-Colonial Studies published in 2013 illustrates, this idea is actually still prevalent in the field of mainstream post-colonial research. The same goes for an already established reference in post-colonial studies. The collection of key concepts implies that post-colonialism mostly concerns Western Europe and its former colonies. See Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin's book, Key Concepts in Postcolonial Studies, published in 2013, or the third edition published in 2013. In exclusion of any other empire, mainstream postcolonial studies has managed to establish and normalize colonialism as a mere Western European issue, and there are to this day hardly any constructive debates about the possibility of going beyond this marked out area. The persistent self-confinement to, quote, the history and legacy of Western colonialism, end quote, Young, 2016, entails, in my view, severe errors in reasoning. And that quote is from Robert J.C. Young, Postcolonialism, A Historical Introduction. The description of this book says, this key new introduction by one of the leading exponents in the field explains in clear and accessible language the historical and theoretical origin of postcolonial theory, acknowledging that postcolonial theory draws on a wide, often contested range of theory from different fields. Young analyzes the concepts and issues involved, explains the meaning of key terms, and interprets the work of some of the major writers concerned to provide an ideal introductory guide for those undergraduates or academics coming to postcolonial theory and criticism for the first time. Back to the text. This is one of the reasons why I would argue that the current normalization of the postcolonial view has two sides, a most welcome side and a side that is deeply problematic. The focus on the temporal and spatial dimension of Western colonialism, with its tremendous power imbalance, on the racial, political, and social hierarchies imposed by European colonizers on non-European people, may have made it indeed appear natural to develop an overall unidirectional discursive framework of any colonial issue. And unidirectional means moving or operating in a single direction. The very framework, however, seems to turn certain phenomena which have been observed in this context erroneously likewise into merely unidirectional phenomena. Take as an obvious example the so-called, quote, logic of coloniality, which is considered by many to be a mere Western logic, as some would have it, an Enlightenment logic. Sorry, I was looking up logic of coloniality. Many implications and consequences of this construct are nowadays, quote, articles of faith, and part of the apparent normality of a, quote, post-colonial view, end quote. If we pick out the field of difference and identify as developed in mainstream post-colonial studies, one could say without undue generalization that one of the most important implications of this specific, quote, logic of coloniality, end quote, is that it translates in the colonial as well as in our contemporary neo-colonial context, quote, differences into values, end quote. Mignolo, 2011. And that's a reference to Walter Mignolo's book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, the description of which says, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, coloniality emerged as a new structure of power as Europeans colonized the Americas and built on the ideas of Western civilization and modernity as the endpoints of historical time and Europe as the center of the world. Walter D. Mignolo argues that coloniality is the darker side of Western modernity, a complex matrix of power that has been created and controlled by Western men and institutions from the Renaissance, when it was driven by Christian theology, through the late 20th century and the dictates of neoliberalism. The cycle of coloniality is coming to an end. Two main forces are challenging Western leadership in the early 21st century. One of these, quote, de-Westernization, is an irreversible shift to the East and struggles over knowledge, economics, and politics. The second force is, quote, decoloniality. Mignolo explains that decoloniality requires de-linking from the colonial matrix of power underlying Western modernity to imagine and build global futures in which human beings and the natural world are no longer exploited in the relentless quest for wealth accumulation. Back to the text. Again, this is not to question the dreadful impact that ideas of superiority and inferiority had on colonized people, or the role these ideas played in justifying the economic exploitation of one group by another. However, on a conceptual level, it would make more sense to stop at the observation that the colonizing powers exercised the option of turning differences into values in favor of their own group and to the detriment of colonized people. Instead of blending the normative ideological into the conceptual, acting on the assumption of a Western, quote, logic that creates this phenomenon in the first place. After all, the observation that people translate differences into values can likewise be made on the other side of the colonial divide. Colonized people, and this is perfectly understandable as a response to devaluation by the colonial rulers, were likewise inclined to insist on their otherness and, quote, cast these differences as synonyms of, quote, cultural superiority, end quote. End quote. Narayan, 1997. And that's in reference to an article by Uma Narayan titled Contesting Futures, quote, Westernization, Respect for Cultures, and Third World Feminists in The Second Wave, A Reader in Feminist Theory, edited by Linda Nicholson. Back to the text, in particular with regard to India, but also other areas colonized by Western powers such as Egypt or the Maghreb. See Ahmed, 1992. Some scholars argue that colonized people conversely increase the value of their own culture. Footnote. Unlike Narayan, who explicitly points to it, Ahmed rather implicitly confirms this phenomenon of reverse inferiorization. End footnote. And the Ahmed being referred to as a Laila Ahmed, Women and Gender in Islam, Historical Roots of a Modern Debate. Shit. Where am I? All right, I'll be in. Where am I? The description for Women and Gender in Islam, Historical Roots of a Modern Debate by Laila Ahmed says, this pioneering study of the social and political lives of Muslim women has shaped a whole generation of scholarship. In it, Laila Ahmed explores the historical roots of contemporary debates, ambitiously surveying Islamic discourse on women from Arabia during the period in which Islam was founded to Iraq during the classical age of Egypt. During the classical age to Egypt during the modern era. The book is now reissued as a Veritas paperback with a new foreword by Kessia Ali, situating the text in its scholarly context and explaining its enduring influence. Back to the text. Dipesh Chakrabarty's well-known study, Provincializing Europe, is another rich source in this respect. Footnote. For a discussion, see Albrecht 2008, chapter 4.1 on, quote, Universalismus und Gender. And footnote. Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference by Dipesh Chakrabarti says, first published in 2000, Dipesh Chakrabarti's influential Provincializing Europe addresses the mythical figure of Europe that is often taken to be the original site of modernity in many histories of capitalist transition in non-Western countries. This imaginary Europe, Dipesh Chakrabarti argues, is built into the social sciences. The very idea of historicizing carries with it some peculiarly European assumptions about disenchanted space, secular time, and sovereignty. Measured against such mythical standards, capitalist transition in the Third World has often seemed either incomplete or lacking. Provincializing Europe proposes that every case of transition to capitalism is a case of translation as well, a translation of existing worlds and their thought, categories into the categories and self-understandings of capitalist modernity, now featuring a new preface in which Chakrabarti responds to his critics. This book globalizes European thought by exploring how it might be renewed both for and from the margins. End footnote. Back to the text. While these studies do not address the question of how this reverse translating of differences into values could possibly fit into the relevant post-colonial, quote, article of faith, end quote, they provide invaluable source material for a widening of the mainstream post-colonial horizon. A related unidirectional concept of mainstream post-colonial studies is certainly the idea and notion of, quote, othering. This idea of, quote, othering, quote, was coined by Gayatri Spivak for the process by which imperial discourse creates its, quote, others, end quote, end quote. See Spivak, 1985. And that's in reference to an article by Spivak titled The Rani of Sirmur, an essay in reading the archives from 1985. The idea of, quote, othering, quote, was coined by Gayatri Spivak for the process by which imperial discourse creates its, quote, others, for the processes of differentiation by which the presumed superior culture of the colonizer experiences a clear upward revaluation. The culture of the colonizer is marked as inferior and uncivilized. The necessity to unthink this concept becomes immediately clear when applied to the just outlined similar but reverse phenomena, where colonized Indian people cast cultural differences as synonyms of their own cultural superiority. They are, quote, othering the colonizers. One could likewise cite cases of, quote, reverse othering, end quote, from the East Central European imperial and colonial context. In these cases, one could argue that, for instance, many Baltic people thought of themselves as culturally superior to their Soviet occupiers. Given the fact that the concept of, quote, othering, time and again repeated by scholars as well as journalists and other opinion makers, by now seems to be naturalized and publicly accepted, it seems to be high time to reflect on the reductionism that this very concept constitutes. Another example from the unidirectional discursive framework of mainstream post-colonial studies is Edward Said's Orientalism. It seems to be no coincidence that a critique of the unidirectionality of post-colonial concepts first appeared in the context of a critique of Said. A few scholars from outside the fields of post-colonial thought discuss this one-way concept from various angles. It was, to my knowledge, Sheldon Pollock, a scholar of South Asian studies, who in an article of 1993 introduced the attribute unidirectionality to the debate along with suggestions for an alternative concept of multidirectionality. Wikipedia says Sheldon Pollock, born 1948, is an American scholar of Sanskrit, the intellectual and literary history of India, and comparative intellectual history. Sheldon Pollock is the Arvind Raghunathan Professor of South Asian Studies at Columbia University. He was the general editor of the Clay Sanskrit Library and founding editor of the Murti Classical Library of India. And the article being referred to by Sheldon Pollock is titled Deep Orientalism, Notes on Sanskrit and Power Beyond the Raj, published in Orientalism and the Postcolonial Predicament, Perspectives on South Asia, New Cultural Studies, edited by Carol Apudalai Breckenridge, 1993. Pollock, back to the text, Pollock particularly directed attention towards the possibility, quote, that, quote, Orientalist constructions, end quote, in the service of colonial domination may be only a specific historical instance of a larger transhistorical, albeit locally inflected, interaction of knowledge and power, end quote. Sheldon Pollock. And suggested, quote, to consider the possibility that the movement of Orientalist knowledge may be multidirectional, end quote. Sheldon Pollock. While Sheldon Pollock underlined that, quote, widening the scope of Orientalism to include discursively similar phenomena is not meant as an attempt to relativize and thereby detoxify European colonialism, end quote. Sheldon Pollock strongly argues that it is, quote, precisely by expanding our analysis that we may be able to isolate a certain morphology of domination that many such discourses share, end quote. Sheldon Pollock. Sheldon Pollock refers to discourses that tend to, quote, naturalize cultural inequality, end quote, by, quote, invoking higher knowledge, end quote. Discourses which create, quote, the idea of race and concurrently legislate racial exclusivity, assert linguistic hierarchy, and claim superiority for the language of the masters, end quote, and so forth. In 2000, the historian Catherine Fleming, a specialist in the modern history of Greece and the broader Mediterranean context, resumed a discussion of the idea of an intrinsic multidirectionality of Edward Said's allegedly unidirectional concept. Let's look up Catherine Fleming. Wikipedia says Catherine Fleming is president and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust and the Alexander S. Onassis Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization in the Department of History at New York University, NYU, as Provost Emerita of the university. She was Provost of NYU from 2016 to 2022. She has been President and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust since 2022. Due to her influence, she is often regarded as one of the most significant figures in the American art world and has been referred to as the most influential woman in American art culture. And the piece being referred to is an article titled Orientalism, the Balkans, and Balkan History, published in the American Historical Review. Back to the text. Catherine Fleming resumed this discussion in relation to the Balkans, acknowledging the work of historians who focus on the, quote, adoption of, quote, Orientalist rhetoric by both East and West, end quote. Catherine Fleming states that due to the way it sheds light on different variations of Orientalist discourse, quote, Orientalism loses much of Orientalism's unidirectionality, parenthesis, as a discourse imposed by the West on the East, end parenthesis, and becomes instead embedded and internalized in the East and West alike, end quote. Catherine E. Fleming. And just like Pollock, Fleming believes that by insisting on the multi-directionality of Orientalist discourse, one gets much closer to what she calls, quote, the nature, of that discourse, end quote. Catherine Fleming. I would even add here that with a consequent broadening of the scope, the term and concept of, quote, Orientalism as such does not make much sense anymore. That goes likewise for other terms and concepts based on the unidirectional discursive framework of postcolonial studies. From this follows that there is a need not just to revise or rethink these postcolonial, quote, articles of faith, but to unthink them and create new ones which mirror the multidirectionality of the phenomena in question. In this case, and for the time being, one could provisionally describe the phenomenon just discussed as, quote, a general principle of construction of cultural identity, end quote. Polisheg, 2005. And that's in reference to a book by Andrea Polisheg. Anyway, carrying on. Many of the post-colonial, quote, articles of faith, which I would consider problematic, seem to be indeed derivatives of the overall unidirectionality of post-colonial thought in the outlined sense. Footnote. And it's just a bunch of citations, so never mind. End footnote. An important objective in this regard should therefore be, in my view, the broadening of the post-colonial horizon, not only in cases of reverse, quote, turning differences into values, end quote, and reverse, quote, othering, end quote, such as the examples just cited, but more general also. The objective would be a shift in terms of a, quote, genuinely comparative and global discussion of colonialism and empire, end quote, Berman, 2011, that would go beyond the time and scope usually being considered. And what's being referenced is an article by Russell A. Berman titled Colonialism and No End, The Other Continuity Theses, published in German Colonialism, Race, the Holocaust, and Post-War Germany, edited by Volker Langben and Mohammed Solana, published in 2011. I already touched upon the so-called successor states to the Soviet Union. It is obvious that the post-colonial model of a Western imposition on or exploitation of a non-Western, quote, other does not apply in this case. Many years of research on post-Soviet post-colonialism, widely ignored by the post-colonial mainstream, brought forth illuminating findings on the experience of people affected by other types of imperial rule than that of the Western colonial and imperial powers, of interest for including of say, the Baltics in the discursive framework of postcolonialism, are not least the reversals of the imperial or colonial situation, most notably the role reversal of, quote, Europeans versus, quote, Orientals. According to post-colonial approaches, the customary colonial opposition is that of a civilized metropolis and a barbaric or primitive periphery. Many people in the Baltic countries, by contrast, consider themselves European and their Soviet occupiers, quote, barbaric, echoing the widespread stereotype of, quote, Russian cultural inferiority, end quote. See Uffelman, 2013. And that's a Dirk Uffelman, whose article being references The Theory as Memory Practice, The Divided Discourse on Poland's Postcoloniality, published in Memory and Theory in Eastern Europe, edited by Liam Blocker, Alexander Etkind, and Yulia Fedora, or Julie Fedor. I don't know. Back to the text. While post-Soviet postcolonialism is already, if rather parallel to instead of part, of postcolonial scholarship, a well-established and prolific field, other imperial powers such as the Ottoman Empire seem to be completely ignored in the postcolonial mainstream. This goes back as far as to the very beginnings of postcolonial scholarship, or more precisely to Edward Said. Said cast the Ottoman Empire, at least for the time period he investigates, in the role of a mere victim of Western imperialism or colonialism. What is more, there is evidence that there are mainstream postcolonial scholars who seem to consider its discussion even detrimental and strive to deliberately exclude it from the debate. In this spirit, an article in the Oxford Handbook of Postcolonial Studies, instead of closing the actually identified research gap of a missing discussion of the Ottoman Empire in postcolonialism, insists that, quote, there are good reasons, end quote, for the omission of this and other Islamic empires. See Said, 2013. And that's a reference to Solomon Said, Empire, Islam, and the Postcolonial, published in the Oxford Handbook of Postcolonial Studies. And for a critique, see Albrecht, 2019. Which is an article titled Comparative Postcolonial Studies, Southeastern European History as Postcolonial History, published in Memory and Postcolonial Studies, Synergies and New Directions, edited by Dirk Gutsche. Back to the text. However, this view certainly did not prevent a small but seemingly growing number of historians of the Ottoman Empire from discovering the unknown territory of postcolonial thought. On the contrary, as the historian Vangelis Ketriotis summarized in his 2013 article, quote, postcolonial criticism encounters late Ottoman studies. Quote, postcolonial criticism has inspired late Ottomanists in various ways, end quote. Vangelis Ketriotis, 2013. And that's in reference, that the article being references postcolonial criticism encounters late Ottoman studies by Vangelis Ketriotis. And the internet says, Evangelos Ketriotis was a Greek historian who held an undergraduate degree from the University of Athens, a master's degree from the University of Essex, and a doctoral degree from Leiden University. He's been a faculty member of Bogazici University since 2005. Back to the text. The wide research field of Ottoman studies seemingly underwent a number of changes over the decades, as historian Norman Neymark summarized in 2002. For a long time there was, and to some degree still may be, a certain tendency toward polarization depending on the background of the respective scholar. Quote, historians of the Ottoman Empire tend to paint a rosy picture of the minority peoples within the Ottoman Empire's borders. By contrast, historians of the subject peoples, Serbs or Bulgarians, Greeks or Armenians, tend to do the opposite. They emphasize the brutality of the Ottoman yoke and the inevitable victories of their respective national movements, or in the case of the Armenians, the inevitable tragedy that engulfed the nation. End quote. Norman Neymark, 2002. And that's in reference to a book, Fires of Hatred, Ethnic Cleansing in 20th Century Europe. So Wikipedia says, Norman Neymark is an American historian. He is Robert and Florence McDonald Professor of Eastern European Studies at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He writes on modern Eastern European history, genocide, and ethnic cleansing in the region. And the book that he wrote is Fires of Hatred, Ethnic Cleansing in 20th Century Europe. So I'm going to look that book up. And the description for Fires of Hatred, Ethnic Cleansing in 20th Century Europe says, of all the horrors of the last century, perhaps the bloodiest century of the past millennium, ethnic cleansing ranks among the worst. The term burst forth in public discourse in the spring of 1992 as a way to describe Serbian attacks on the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but as this landmark book attests, ethnic cleansing is neither new nor likely to cease in our time. Norman Neymark, distinguished historian of Europe and Russia, provides an insightful history of ethnic cleansing and its relationship to genocide and population transfer. Focusing on 5 specific cases, he exposes the myths about ethnic cleansing, in particular the commonly held belief that the practice stems from ancient hatreds. Neymark shows that this phase of genocide had its roots in the European nationalism of the late 19th century, but found its most virulent expression in the 20th century as modern states and societies began to organize themselves by ethnic criteria. The most obvious example, and one of Neymark's cases, is the Nazi attack on the Jews that culminated in the Holocaust. Neymark also discusses the Armenian genocide of 1915 and the expulsion of Greeks from Anatolia during the Greco-Turkish War of 1921-22, the Soviet forced deportations of Chechen Ingush and the Crimean Tatars in 1944, the Polish and Czechoslovak expulsion of the Germans in 1944-47, and Bosnia and Kosovo. In this harrowing history, Neymark reveals how over and over, as racism and religious hatreds picked up an ethnic name tag, war provided a cover for violence and mayhem, an evil tapestry behind which nations acted with impunity. Back to the text. Since then, further changes in Ottoman historiography could be observed. In the latter camp in particular, there is a tendency in some areas to counter the earlier nationalistic view, in turn with a somewhat euphemistic delineation of Ottoman rule. There are still traces of this euphemistic view to be found. A 2012 study of and this is the title, Muslim-Christian Coexistence and Its Destruction in Late Ottoman Anatolia, for instance, received severe criticism in this regard as a, quote, ideologically contaminated, end quote, book that brings to the fore almost exclusively the harmonious aspect of the everyday coexistence of these groups. See Zalepos, 2014. And Ioannis Zalepos, his book, is the person who wrote the review of the book, which is by Nicholas Doumanis. And again, it's called Before the Nation, Muslim-Christian Coexistence and Its Destruction in Late Ottoman Anatolia. And the description for this book says, the Greek Christians expelled from Anatolia between 1912 and 1924 often spoke about earlier times when they, quote, lived well with the Turks, end quote. They yearned for the days when they worked and drank coffee together, participated in each other's festivals, and even revered the same saints in miracle-working shrines. Historians have never given serious regard to such oral traditions, given that the refugees had been victims of horrific, quote, ethnic violence that appeared to reflect deep pre-existing animosities. This book considers the rationality of such unlikely nostalgic traditions, which happen to be common among refugees from dismembered multi-ethnic societies. It claims that intercommunality, a mode of everyday living based on the accommodation of cultural difference, normally played a stabilizing function within societies like the Ottoman Empire. Along with a genuine longing for lost homelands, the refugees were nostalgic for moral environments in which religious communities claimed to have lived in accordance with their respective religious and ethical values. Although these traditions depicted worlds that were implausibly pristine, the intention was to counter the dominant but spurious national narrative, which reviled Turks as irredeemable barbarians and dismissed these refugee histories of coexistence as pure fantasy. Drawing largely from an oral archive containing 5,000 interviews, the book investigates the mentalities, cosmologies, and value systems of these ordinary Anatolians and shows how their popular perspectives pose serious challenges to the historiography. The book also examines the role of political violence in destroying this Ottoman society and the way it effectively transformed these Anatolians into Greeks and Turks. Back to the text. At present, however, a more balanced approach seems to prevail, at least outside of Turkey's official presentation of history. See Reinkovsky, 2011, and Seufert, 2008. In the Reinkovsky article being referred to is titled The Ottoman Empire in Southeastern Europe from a Turkish Perspective, published in Images of Imperial Legacy, Modern Discourses on the Social and Cultural Impact of Ottoman and Habsburg Rule in Southeast Europe. Edited by T. Sindbake and Maximilian Hartmut. Published in 2011. And who's the other person? Seufert. It's a reference to an article in German by Günther Seufert. It's I think it says Religiöse Minderheiten in der Türkei. And that's from 2008. Back to the text. The authors of an article titled Dilemmas of Ottoman Legacy may capture this state when they write that, quote, It is tempting to view the Ottoman mosaic of ethnic and religious communities as an instance of, quote, multiculturalism, end quote, avant le mot, or avant le mot, I don't know how to say that, end quote. Yet, by the same token, they emphasize that great caution is needed here, quote, just as the, quote, Turkish yoke, end quote, is a creation of a modernist and nationalist historical paradigm, quote, multiculturalism in the Ottoman Empire is also subject to the same fallacy of trying to narrate the past with today's lexicon, end quote. And that's from an article by Yilmaz and Yosmaglu, published in 2008. And that article is titled Fighting the Specters of the Past, Dilemmas of Ottoman Legacy in the Balkans and the Middle East, published in 2008 in Middle Eastern Studies. As for the relation of Ottoman studies to post-colonial studies, about the turn of the 21st century, a small group of 19th century historians began to sound out the usefulness, or perhaps uselessness, of post-colonial thought for Ottoman studies. They were surprised about the lack of interest in the Ottoman Empire in the field of mainstream post-colonialism. As Salim Derengil put it in 2003, quote, although it covered a huge geography until its last days, and its study presents fruitful challenges to any student of colonialism and post-colonialism, the 19th century Ottoman Empire has been largely ignored by the literature covering these issues, end quote. Derengil, 2003. Salim Derengil was born in 1951 and is a Turkish academic and professor of history at Boğaziçi University and at the Lebanese American University. And the piece being referred to is an article titled They Live in a State of Nomadism and Savagery, published in The Late Ottoman Empire and the Post-Colonial Debate. That's a quote, sorry. The piece is titled, quote, They Live in a State of Nomadism and Slavery, unquote. The Late Ottoman Empire and the Post-Colonial Debate, published in Comparative Studies in Society and History, published in 2003. And there's a footnote that says, as Derengil likewise pointed out, ignorance can also be observed in the, quote, subaltern group, end quote, who, quote, completely ignores that there existed a major non-Western sovereign state whose destinies were in many ways intertwined with the destinies of India, end quote, and adds in a footnote, quote, witness the fact that there is no mention of the politics of pan-Islamism in subaltern studies, volumes 1 to 10, between 1982 and 1999, end quote. Salim Derengil. End footnote. At present, some still refer to the, quote, Ottoman Empire's uncomfortable positionality in post-colonial studies, end quote, and tend to be cautious in their assessment of whether or not a post-colonial approach is of use. And that quote is from a piece by Alain Michael and Christine M. Filou, titled The Ottoman Empire and the Imperial Turn, published in Comparative Studies in Society and History in 2012. There seem to be, broadly speaking, two different approaches to this question. Some strive to theorize the late Ottoman Empire as an imperial power with colonial aspirations, such as Vangelis Ketriotis, who pointed out that, quote, 19th century historians, have reversed the argument and tend to include the Ottoman Empire not among the states that were subject to colonization, but among the colonizers, end quote. Ketriotis, 2013. Salim Derengil likewise assumes, quote, that sometime in the 19th century, end quote, the Ottomans, although quite different from the British or French, quote, adopted a colonial stance toward the peoples of the periphery of their empire, end quote. Salim Derengil, 2003. Other scholars question the Ottoman Empire's comparability with Western powers and disapprove of the various imaginative linguistic acquisitions from the history of colonialism, quote, the Ottoman civilizing mission, end quote. Herzog and Motika, 2000, or, quote, the Ottoman man's burden, end quote. Makdisi, 2002, or, quote, Ottoman Orientalism, end quote. Makdisi, 2002A and Makdisi, 2002B. And these are references to two pieces by Usama Makdisi, the first being titled, quote, the first one being titled Ottoman Orientalism, and the second being Rethinking Ottoman Imperialism, Modernity, Violence, and the Cultural Logic of Ottoman Reform, published in The Empire in the City, Arab Provincial Capitals in the Late Ottoman Empire, edited by Jens Hansen, Thomas Philly, and Stefan Weber, published in 2002. And the other is Herzog and Christoph Herzog and Raoul Motika's article, Orientalism a la Turca, late 19th/early 20th century Ottoman voyages into the Muslim, quote, outback, end quote. Back to the text. These scholars insist that, quote, the fundamental elements of modern colonialism, end quote, are taken into account. See Tursay, 2013. Which is an article titled The Ottoman Empire Seen Through the Lens of Postcolonial Studies, a Recent Historiographical Turn. And that's from 2018. Originally 2013. Still under discussion is also the reverse approach to the Ottoman Empire as a victim of the Western powers' drive for expansion. That is the approach Edward Said introduced to the debate. From the perspective of German history, for example, it seems to be obvious that the Wilhelmine Empire strived for, quote, German dominance in Ottoman space, end quote. A kind of dominance that some would call, quote, a colonial empire in all but name, end quote. See Krob, 2014, and Mag Shamrain, 2009. Something in German. I'm not going to even try to read that, just for the purposes of keeping it moving. And Rachel Mag Shamrain, I don't know if I'm saying that right, article, Displacing Orientalism, Ottoman Jihad, German Imperialism, and the Armenian Genocide, published in Encounters with Islam in German Literature and Culture, edited by James Hodkinson and Jeffrey Morrison, published in 2009. Florian Krob, in a recent article, points out that, quote, Germany's official policies towards Turkey, end quote, at that time, quote, showed traits of informal imperialism, end quote. Florian Kraub. Florian Kraub borrows a term coined by two historians of the British Empire, John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson, in an influential 1953 article on economic history. And that's referring to an article titled The Imperialism of Free Trade, published in the Economic History Review in 1953 by John Gallagher and Ronald Robinson. The economic historian Sevket Pamuk, while he likewise discusses the concept of, quote, formal colony and, quote, informal empire, end quote, underlies this in this context, quote, the inability of any European power to transform the Ottoman Empire into a formal colony or incorporate the Ottoman Empire into its informal empire, end quote, because, quote, no single bracket European end bracket power was able to exclude its competitors from the Ottoman Empire, end quote. Pamuk, 1988. And that's referring to an article titled The Ottoman Empire in Comparative Perspective. And Sevket Pamuk is a retired professor of economics and history at Bogazici Bosphorus University and author of prize-winning books and articles. Between 2007 and 2013, Sevket Pamuk was chair of contemporary Turkish studies at the European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. He is a leading economic historian of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East. I don't need to read all this. This is too much. Back to the text. My own interest in and advocacy for incorporating the Ottoman Empire into the post-colonial debate stems from a culture studies background and does not include the ambition to solve the unresolved questions in the field of historiography. While a culture studies approach likewise does not, in my view, permit any kind of ahistorical lines of argument, the kind of questions posed in this field are certainly different. Scholarship in the wide field of memory studies, for example, is not so concerned with whether or not the Ottoman Empire could be described as a colonial power, but rather how it was and is perceived by various interest groups. In this respect, the legacy of centuries of Ottoman rule, at the latest since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, in contemporary post-Ottoman countries is certainly highly interesting. The Ottoman imprint on the Balkans and the Middle East, to cite the title of a study of the mid-1990s, written by Brown, for example, was followed by a related publication in 2011 on, and this is the title, Cultural Impact of Ottoman and Habsburg Rule in Southeastern Europe, by Sindbake and Hartmuth, 2011. The description for Imperial Legacy, the Ottoman Imprint on the Balkans and the Middle East by Leon Carl Brown says, the Ottoman Empire ranks alongside the Roman and Byzantine as one of the most powerful and long-lasting imperial systems in world history, in existence from the late 13th until 1923, and embracing at its height most of southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire was certainly the most imposing and arguably the most influential political system over the course of more than a millennium of Islamic history. Though the Ottoman Empire left an indelible mark on people in many parts of the world, in the modern West its influence is little understood. For many living in former Ottoman-controlled regions, the heritage is often rejected or misrepresented as unwanted alien domination. Quote, imperial legacy gathers together distinguished scholars to demonstrate how the Ottoman legacy continues to shape patterns of behavior and perceptions among the peoples of Western Asia, North Africa, and Southeastern Europe. The authors also explore how this complex history is reinscribed by nations and ethnic groups in the building of ideologies and identities today, ranging widely through issues including politics, diplomacy, education, language, and religion. These essays also address the different regional perspectives on the Ottoman legacy found in the Arab world, the Balkans, and the Republic of Turkey. And the other book is titled Cultural Impact of Ottoman and Habsburg Rule in Southeast Europe. The description for this book says, there has been a tendency to view the history of the Balkans as essentially determined by historical legacies, whether in scholarly literature and popular discourse. The Ottoman or Habsburg past are thought to be accountable for a large variety of phenomena ranging from democratic culture, or the lack thereof, and adaptability to a free market economy, to nepotism and the filthiness of public facilities. By contrast, the papers in this volume demonstrate that, quote, legacies are not unchanging determinants. Instead, they are very much open to constant reinterpretations and reassessments depending on conditions in the present. They are, in short, as much shaped by the present as they are by the past. Back to the text. These are simultaneous studies that provide highly interesting material that could be exploited in the field of post-colonial studies. Footnote, a likewise interesting, very recent endeavor was a conference at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, titled Ambivalent Legacies, Memory and Amnesia in Post-Habsburg and Post-Ottoman Cities, hosted by the Max Planck Research Group, titled Empires of Memory, the Cultural Politics of Historicity in Former Habsburg and Ottoman Cities. End footnote. One of the well-known key premises of memory studies is the assumption that we reconstruct the past from the perspective of the present and according to our present-day needs. That memory is the, quote, past made present, end quote, so to speak. See Terdeman, 1993. And that's referring to a book titled Present Past, Modernity and the Memory Crisis. And the description for this book, Present Past, Modernity and the Memory Crisis by Richard Terdeman from 2018 says, this book is about memory, about how the past persists into the present, and about how this persistence has been understood over the past 2 centuries. Since the French Revolution, memory has been the source of an intense disquiet. Fundamental cultural theories have sought to understand it and have striven to represent its stresses. Back to the text. Ever since this fundamental insight by Maurice Halbwachs, I don't know if I'm saying that right, in the early 20th century, it has become almost a matter of common knowledge that memory is an issue for our contemporary concerns. Maurice Halbwachs lived from 1877 to 1945 and was a French philosopher and sociologist known for developing the concept of collective memory. Halbwachs also contributed to the sociology of knowledge with his La topographie légendaire des évangiles en terre sainte, a study of the spatial infrastructure of the New Testament, published in 1951. Back to the text. While historians may insist that, for instance, quote, the, quote, Turkish yoke, end quote, is a creation of a modernist and nationalist historical paradigm, end quote. See Yilmaz and Yos Mauglo, 2008. Scholars in the field of cultural memory studies are interested in the motives and the purpose of dealing with the past. These scholars are interested in topics such as the, quote, political choice, end quote, of what is remembered, how it is remembered, and what is not remembered. See Irvin Erickson, Lapointe, and Hinton, 2013. And that's a reference to Douglas Irvin Erickson, Thomas Lapointe, and Alexander Laban Hinton's introduction, Hidden Genocides, Power, Knowledge, Memory, published in Hidden Genocides, Power, Knowledge, Memory, edited by Alexander Laban Hinton, Thomas Lapointe, and Douglas Irvin Erickson, published in 2013. A cultural studies approach to the Ottoman Empire from a post-colonial perspective, or to the Soviet Empire for that matter, naturally includes a reconceptualizing and re-theorizing of the, quote, post-colonial, end quote. It should begin with the identification and redressing of the conceptual roadblocks of the unidirectional, discursive framework in post-colonialism. Both research on the Ottoman Empire and on the Soviet Empire provide invaluable tools, not just for the deconstruction of mainstream post-colonial premises. These tools may also help to generate a genuine multi-directional approach, in the sense outlined earlier on, that will meet the challenges of the many commonalities and diversities of imperial and colonial experiences and legacies. As a working assumption, the Ottoman Empire, the Soviet Empire may be understood. Here I am following in parts the anthropologist Sarah Green, as political orders which used to organize the various ethnic and religious groups differently or similarly compared to other political orders, as political orders which would engender different or similar patterns of imperial experience. See Green, 2005. And that's a reference to Sarah Green's book, Notes from the Balkans, Locating Marginality and Ambiguity on the Greek-Albanian Border. And the description for this book, Notes from the Balkans, Locating Marginality and Ambiguity in the Greek-Albanian Border by Sarah F. Green, says, maps and borders notwithstanding, some places are best described as, quote, gaps, places with repeatedly contested boundaries that are wedged in between other places that have clear boundaries. The book explores an iconic example of this in the contemporary Western imagination, the Balkans. Drawing on richly detailed ethnographic research around the Greek-Albanian border, Sarah Green focuses her groundbreaking analysis on the ambiguities of never quite resolving where or what places are. One consequence for some Greek peoples in this border area is a seeming lack of distinction, but in a distinctly, quote, Balkan way. In gaps, which are never empty, marginality is, in contrast with conventional understandings, not a matter of difference and separation, it is a lack thereof. Notes from the Balkans represents the first ethnographic approach to exploring, quote, the Balkans as an ideological concept. Sarah F. Green argues that rather than representing a tension between, quote, West and, quote, East, the Balkans make such oppositions ambiguous. This kind of marginality means that such places and peoples can hardly engage with, quote, multiculturalism. Moreover, the region's ambiguity threatens clear modernist distinctions. The violence so closely associated with the region can therefore be seen as part of continual attempts to resolve the ambiguities by imposing fixed separations. And every time this fails, the region is once again defined as a place that will continually proliferate such dangerous ambiguity and could spread it elsewhere. Or could spread it somewhere else. Back to the text. What is highly interesting about the Ottoman and Soviet versions of imperialism for the discussion of post-colonial premises is the different basic constellations of rulers and ruled. Unlike in Western colonialism, it was, for instance, not European Christian colonizers against non-European, non-Christian colonized people. The majority of those, quote, ruled by the Ottomans, quote, were of the same religion, end quote, as the rulers. What we are looking at in the Ottoman Empire's European areas is predominantly, quote, Christian subordination to Muslim rule, end quote. As Vangelis Katriotis put it, what is necessary here is reflection on the, quote, implications, end quote, of these reverse situations of imperial rule, quote, for thinking about ... domination, end quote, and about what he calls the, quote, Ottoman version of colonialism, end quote. Several other reverse situations of imperial rule come to bear in this regard. To mention one more example, when Greece started its War of Independence in 1821, and several years later became, in Christine Filiou's words, quote, the first independent successor state to the Ottoman Empire, end quote, the Greek people, as Gregory Jusdanis put it, quote, sought freedom in rather than from Europe, end quote. Jusdanis, 2011. And the Christine Filiou article being referenced is The Paradox of Perceptions, Interpreting the Ottoman Past Through the National Present, published in Middle Eastern Studies in 2008, as well as and Gregory Jusdanis, what book was being referenced here? Gregory Jusdanis' book, The Necessary Nation, published in 2011. Princeton University Press describes The Necessary Nation by Gregory Jusdanis this way. In this controversial look at nationalism, Gregory Jusdanis offers a sweeping defense of the nation as a protector of cultural difference and a catalyst for modernization. Since the end of the Cold War, the nation-state has undergone intense scrutiny among critics in the media and academy. Many believe that civic nationalism may be fruitful, but that cultural nationalism fosters xenophobia and backwards thinking. Jusdanis, however, emphasizes the positive collaboration between nation-building and culture. Through a series of critical readings of multicultural, post-colonial, and globalization theorists, the author reveals how nationalism enables people to defend their distinctive ways of life, to fight colonial oppression, and to build an independent society of citizens. He explains why people over the last 200 years have politicized their ethnic identities and have sought a union of culture and power within an autonomous nation-state. While seeking to defend nationalism, Jusdanis also examines its potential to unleash extraordinary violence into the world. Justinus thus proposes federalism as a political solution to the challenges posed by nationalism and globalization. Gregory Justinus applies the tools of disciplines ranging from anthropology to philosophy as he explores the nation-building projects of numerous and diverse countries around the world. What emerges is a fresh perspective on the subjects of national culture, identity, political nations, globalization, postcolonialism, and diaspora. No. So moving on. Hold on, well, actually, 1 second. Apparently, Christine Filiu specialized in the connected histories of the Balkan and Middle East since the 17th century, focusing particularly on the emergence of the Greek and Turkish nation-states out of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. She has worked and is interested more broadly in comparative empires and in interfaces between cultures and histories in Europe and the Middle East. Her books, Biography of an Empire, Governing Ottomans in an Age of Revolution, published in 2011, and Turkey, A Past Against History, published in 2021, have been translated into both Greek and Turkish. And Christine Filiu has published widely in scholarly journals as well as in broader forums such as Public Books and Jadalia. She is currently working on a third book and developing a collaborative digital/public humanities project, the aim of which is a granular reconstruction and analysis of the Greek Orthodox communities in the larger context of late Ottoman Istanbul/Constantinople, 1821 to 1923, using a wide range of Ottoman and Greek sources. More information can be found here in some link. Okay. So, back to the text. What else may be of epistemological value in the envisioned broadening of the post-colonial horizon? In my view, Sheldon Pollock and Catherine Fleming show us the way with their suggestion of what Pollock calls a, quote, morphology of domination, end quote. Pollock, 1993, and Catherine Fleming describes as, quote, the nature, end quote, of the, quote, Orientalist discourse, end quote. Although I am not necessarily in favor of these terms and descriptions as such, I think that they point to an area where, first, post-colonial questions extend far into our present-day concerns, for instance, to issues of multicultural societies, and second, the need for a multi-directional approach to imperial or colonial past and a post-imperial or post-colonial present becomes most apparent. Certainly, the fact that a wide range of completely new case studies becomes conceivable in the first place points to a necessity for a fresh look at, quote, the post-colonial. Examples in the field of literary culture studies, and certainly the numerous authors from successor states to the Soviet and Ottoman empires, for instance, the Baltics, the Middle East, or the Balkans, who have yet to be discovered from a wider post-colonial perspective. One of many obvious examples is the Greek author Nikos Kazantzakis, who grew up on the Isle of Crete. That's how you say that place. Ottoman-occupied Crete, to be precise. Wikipedia says Nikos Kazantzakis lived from 1883 to 1957 and was a Greek writer, journalist, politician, poet, and philosopher. Widely considered a giant of modern Greek literature, Nikos Kazantzakis was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 9 different years and remains the most translated Greek author worldwide. Kazantzakis' novels include Zorba the Greek, published in 1946 as Life and Times of Alexis Zorbas, Christ Recrucified, 1948. Captain Michaelis, 1950, translated as Freedom or Death. The Last Temptation of Christ, published in 1955. Nikos Kazantzakis also wrote plays, travel books, memoirs, and philosophical essays, such as The Saviors of God, Spiritual Exercises. Nikos Kazantzakis' fame spread in the English-speaking world due to cinematic adaptations of Zorba the Greek in 1964 and The Last Temptation of Christ it's a Martin Scorsese movie with Willem Dafoe in 1988. Nikos Kazantzakis also translated a number of notable works into modern Greek, such as the Divine Comedy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, On the Origin of Species, and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Back to the text. A short comparative glance at Kazantzakis' novel Freedom or Death of 1953 and Chinua Achebe's seminal post-colonial novel Things Fall Apart of 1958 may in conclusion indicate the potential of new case studies and the kind of new question that can be posed in a wider post-colonial horizon. Captain Michaelis is a 1953 novel by Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis. In English, German, and French translations, as well as many others, it is known as Freedom or Death. The writer was influenced by his early years on the island of Crete and uses explicit Cretan Greek words and the Cretan idiom in a way that preserves it untouched. It is one of the most widely read books of modern Greek literature, which has been translated and published in several languages. Chinua Achebe was born in 1930 and died in 2013. Was a Nigerian novelist, poet, and critic who is regarded as a central figure of modern African literature. Chinua Achebe's first novel and magnum opus, Things Fall Apart, published in 1958, occupies a pivotal place in African literature and remains the most widely studied, translated, and read African novel. Along with Things Fall Apart, Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, published in 1960, Arrow of God, 1964, completes the, quote, African trilogy. Later novels include A Man of the People, published in 1966, and Anthills of the Savannah, published in 1987. Achebe is often referred to as the, quote, father of modern African literature, and, quote, although Chinua Achebe vigorously rejected the characterization. And Things Fall Apart is a 1958 novel by Nigerian author Chinua Achebe. It is Achebe's debut novel and was written when he was working at the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation. The novel was first published in London by Heinemann on the 17th of June, 1958. The story of Things Fall Apart, which is set in British Nigeria, centers on Okonkwo, a traditional influential leader of the fictional Igbo clan, Umuofia, who opposes colonialism and early Christianity. The novel's title is taken from a verse of, quote, The Second Coming, a 1919 poem by Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Things Fall Apart was considered Achebe's magnum opus and formed his, quote, African trilogy, with his other novels No Longer at Ease and Arrow of God. The novel, Things Fall Apart, explores many themes, especially culture, masculinity, and colonialism. Things Fall Apart is regarded as a milestone in African literature. Things Fall Apart gained critical acclaim and popularity upon publication, and has been translated into over 50 languages. It was listed on the Times 100 Best English Language Novels from 1923 to 2005. The novel has had several adaptations, including the radio drama Akon Quo, 1961, by the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation. The 1971 film Things Fall Apart, which starred Princess Elizabeth of Toro. Back to the text. I am aware, though, that the epistemological value of literary texts is obvious to literary scholars, but in need of explanation to anybody else. 2 sentences in this respect seem to be advisable at this point. The advantage of literature as a source of knowledge about historical, political, and social realities, and on how these realities are being experienced, is that writers may ask for cause and effects different from those considered in academic and public discourse, and ideally provide alternate visions. Literary texts are ideally, as Jan Philip Remsma puts it, what, quote, in the field of sociology is likewise considered to be a legitimate means of insight, thought experiments, end quote. And that's referring to an article by Jan Philip Rensma titled Lust and Gewalt, published in Die Zeit in 2007. In this sense, just like scholars in the humanities and social sciences, writers may also be capable of rethinking, exploring, and deconstructing ideologies or premises otherwise taken for granted. Therefore, they may be able to introduce new insights into the post-colonial debate. Chinua Achebe certainly did this with his writing. The potential of Nikos Kazantzakis in that respect has yet to be explored. Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart is set in colonial Nigeria of the 1890s. Kazantzakis' Freedom or Death on the island of Crete at about the same time, when Crete was still, I don't know if I'm saying that right, is it Crete or Crete? I can't remember. A culture studies question would not be whether Nigeria or Crete could be designated as colonies. Nigeria certainly would. Crete may be or maybe not.
Crete.
Oh, no, it's Crete. It's not Crete. Crete, excuse me. God, I'm dumb. A cultural studies question would not be whether Nigeria or Crete could be designated as colonies. Nigeria certainly was. Crete may be or maybe not. Moreover, Crete can certainly not stand for the entire Ottoman Empire. Rather, as historian Pinar Senizik put it, what distinguished Crete, quote, from other provinces of the Ottoman Empire, end quote, was resistance on a very large scale and the, quote, high frequency of its revolts, end quote. Senizik, 2011. And that's from the book The Transformation of Ottoman Crete, Revolts, Politics, and Identity in the Late 19th Century. And the description of this book, Pinar Senizik, The Transformation of Ottoman Crete, Revolts, Politics, and Identity in the Late 19th Century, says, the island of Crete under Ottoman rule in the 19th century saw successive revolts from its majority Christian population and were set on union with the newly independent Greece. This book offers an original perspective on the social, political, and ideological transformation of Ottoman Crete within the nationalist context of the late 19th century. It focuses on the Cretan revolts of 1896 and 1897 and examines the establishment of the autonomous Cretan state and the withdrawal of Ottoman troops from the island in 1898. Based on Ottoman, British, and American archival sources, the author demonstrates that contrary to the standard view, the uprisings were merely an expression of discontent at Ottoman rule. Cretan Christians, in fact, aimed to radically change the socioeconomic and political structure of Cretan society and to actually overthrow and expel the Ottoman administration. This book provides a deeper understanding of the Cretan experience and of the wider politics of the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 19th century. Back to the text. Ottoman rule in other parts such as Anatolia or the Balkans brought out different forms of resistance or collaboration. However, a culture studies question could be, for instance, what kind of rationale does the author Chinua Achebe develop in his novel in order to explain the phenomenon of, quote, things falling apart, end quote. Achebe is certainly famous for his depiction of the social cohesion of the Igbo society. The specific way this society, quote, holds together, so to speak, before it falls apart. What are the conditions under which a tightly woven social fabric can actually, quote, fall apart in the colonial encounter? And why does the Greek writer Kazantzakis, despite the fact that he describes power hierarchies very similar to that in Achebe's novel, think that the Cretan society did not fall apart? Kazantzakis depicts harsh discrimination of the population of Crete by the Turkish rulers of the island, rebellion and suppression of the revolts, violence on both sides, and certainly the potential for a falling apart of the Cretan society because of the imperial situation. A comparison of the two novels suggests that the difference arises from the relational constellation of ruler and ruled. According to Achebe, British colonization brought major cultural differences to colonized Nigeria. In Kazantzakis' setting, the culture and societies of Ottomans and Greeks, both patriarchal, both sharing similar values, are, with the exception of religious beliefs, basically very much alike. Is this kind of insight that a discussion of post-colonial or post-imperial writers, in particular if they are major writers like in this case, can contribute to a wider post-colonial debate? It is these kinds of questions against the backdrop of an entire new set of comparative studies that a wider post-colonial approach will be able to discuss. The potential of new objects of investigation in the field of literary culture studies alone is obvious. So is the scope of possible new comparisons of the familiar post-colonial texts, say from and about India or Africa, with as yet unfamiliar post-Soviet or post-Ottoman texts. To name an example, that the recent 70th anniversary of the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 brings to mind. No post-colonial taboo should prevent scholars from comparing texts about the partition of India and the population exchange after the end of British rule, with texts about the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, with its population exchange in Turkey and Greece. These texts include displacement and extinction of Anatolian ethnic groups and the Armenian genocide. On the whole, what will come in view with a widening of the post-colonial horizon are, quote, recurring political, intellectual, and cultural practices, end quote, as well as, quote, ideological constructions and similar functioning mechanisms, end quote. They will all show the necessity to exceed the unidirectional discursive framework set by mainstream post-colonial studies and the need to strive for a multi-directional approach to post-colonial and post-imperial phenomena. However small the input of the respective case study may be, these kinds of new comparisons and juxtapositions have a contribution to make. This change is necessary if we want to sound out the idea of the, quote, post-colonial, end quote, as an explanatory tool for the understanding of today's post-imperial and post-colonial world. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.